everybody, and welcome to part 2 of this particular podcast regarding Christians and conspiracy theories. You might notice we've had a bit of a beard shave since then. I like to share the sheep at least once per year. Just nice to see the difference, I guess. But I thought I'd actually just give a bit of context to some of this thinking around how we as Christians should approach this epistemologically. So that big fancy word, epistemology, basically means a theory of knowing or a theory of knowledge. And I think as Christians, faith as a category of epistemology, a way of knowing things, this means that Christians are already predisposed toward believing despite rational proofs. Not to say that there aren't logical and well-informed reasons for believing things without logical proofs, but that is to say we already have this kind of a predisposition despite evidence, you could say. And these types of people are in any body or in any actually group of people. We see that, mysticism is present in probably every world tradition, every thinking tradition in written history, pretty much. I also think that actually as Christians there is a confirmation bias and echo chambers that come into play. And we talked a little bit about this in the podcast so far, this idea that actually our current digital technologies actually play into this. They don't actually help us to see different points of view. But actually, when we're surrounded by communities that are echoing the same thoughts and the same ways of thinking, it can be very hard to actually break out into another way of seeing things. But this all said, I think that there are ways to actually make sense of this. I think that Augustine's idea, the great church father, of all truth is God's truth, means that we can find redeeming virtue in all manners of perspectives and all manners of worldviews. But we still have to be discerning to test what is true, what is life-affirming, and what is loving. See, I think a theistic epistemology affirms the possibility of knowing truth and being able to logically infer truth. It affirms a world of order and chaos that can be examined and made sense of in its sophistication in terms of detail and design. This in turn means that our own empirical observations have real-world applicability of being observable, observably true, and thus workable in reality. This is because it's based on that creator, that God who has actually affirmed the possibility of our observations being true. Christianity, I think, resolves the tension of the one and the many, and the relative places of both subjective and objective truths by framing belief in terms of a relationship with God who transcends the created universe, which he has set within limits and laws to govern it. It promotes a worldview that advocates for individual accountability in way of sin and righteousness, that's the one, but also acknowledges that a fallen world and sin's corruption at every perceivable and imperceptible layer of creation means there is, of course, degradation we are not responsible for, but still affected by inevitably. That's the many. With relation to conspiracy theories, we affirm that a theistic epistemology means affirming the reality that some of these theories may be true. With some of these theories, only aspects may be true. However, we also acknowledge that creation's corruption also influences our ability to reason and infer, and that our observations are best informed when humbly submitted with an acknowledgement of our limitations and lack of understanding. You think of Solomon's example, someone who by royal pedigree in the Israel aristocracy, David's son, he was someone who actually would have probably been naturally intelligent, naturally so inclined, and yet he deferred to God in that instance, referred to God in that instance to say, I still require wisdom to make the right judgments. the best judgments in terms of how to actually govern your people. Therefore, acknowledging that a relational knowing with reference and deference to a creator considers this, we also know we can rely in God's wisdom, and especially his scriptures, to demolish strongholds, to be transformed by the renewing of our minds, and to sincerely know the truth, the way, and the life. And this enables us to say, well, that is clearly false, that is clearly untrue, that can be proven and be shown to be untrue. I think this is where we can actually get some kind of mental orientation or trajectory regarding these kind of ideas. But I think that's enough from me with that regard, and I hope this explains a little bit of actually where the themes within both these parts actually fall. Here's hoping that you enjoy part 2. Thanks again, everybody.
What do you think of the idea that the Earth is flat and has a giant ice wall around the edge?
The idea or the truth?
Sorry, you're straight facing it, so I mean, like, I don't want to disrespect you, man. I mean, I've gone to the top of the Sky Tower. I feel like I've seen some curvature. I don't know what to tell you, man.
To those who may be flat earthers, I do apologize. I'm not a flat earther.
Not a flat earther either. Apologies.
I try my best not to make jokes about it.
This particular theory?
Yeah, because I know that a lot of flat earthers are quite
sincere in their belief.
Yeah, very sincere in their belief, and I think a lot of them are very strengthened in that idea when we just instantaneously laugh it off.
Yeah,
because it's kind of invalidating any ideas that they may have, and to them they've been convinced of something, and some of the arguments, when you look into the arguments of flat earth theory, they're using mathematics and they're using physics in their arguments, and then for someone who doesn't understand physics or meteorology or mathematics, if they're just going into it with an open mind, they might come out thinking, but obviously most people won't. But it's been, the flat earth theory has been growing a lot over the last maybe decade or so, maybe less.
Why do you think that is?
I think it might be to do with the socio-political climate of the Western world,
right?
Becoming more and more divisive, and a lot of people just not trusting in news media, a lot of people not trusting in mainstream think tanks and ideologues. Like, you know, they're kind of like, well, that's one thing that we've been taught our whole life, you know, that the earth is a globe, and obviously that's the big thing that they're trying to cover up, you know. And I think that might be a big reason, is again, people trying to find issues with something that's not themselves. Right. I think that's very reflective of flat earth theory. I think the wackiest, and I think a lot of flat earthers would agree with me that this is somewhat wacky. The wackiest flat earth theory I did encounter was when I was working for the Department of Corrections.
Yes.
I may have told you about this previously. I had an offender whom I was managing a community-based sentence of, and they were telling me that they believed in a flat earth, and I was like, okay, yeah. So usually people like start to treat me like I'm really stupid after that, and I said, well, if you believe that, you believe that. That doesn't make you stupid. It's just I'm sure you may have done some research into it. And they're like, yeah, I've been researching it for years. And I was like, well, yeah, I may disagree with your ideas, but that doesn't mean that, you know, the conviction of your belief isn't strong. And I know that's a silly argument at times, because people are convicted of some very silly things.
Yeah, it's that idea of that sincerity
Yeah.
in and of itself
But-
is not a measure of truth.
Yeah, definitely. But the wacky part of their belief was that not only is the Earth flat, but the powers that be are producing oil on the underside of the flat Earth and pumping it up to the surface, which is how we drill for oil, and that it was somehow related to oil controlling the world, and we need to stop. We need to stop taking in what is being called fossil fuels, but are actually being created on the underside of the flat Earth. So that's probably the most intense flat Earth theory I've heard.
It's curious, like this idea. Like I'd love to come back to this, but like a lot of I believe in this idea that a good lie has a grain of truth to it, right?
Yeah.
And it's like the idea that actually macro conglomerates are, running the world. That's not a far off exaggeration from the actual truth, right? Like when you've got businesses that are so big, they're actually starting to dictate to governments how actually things should happen and things should occur. Like TPPA a couple of years ago, being an example of this. It's you can see where people actually trying to see the cohesion, see the unity in these ideas, right?
Yeah.
And extend some love out to this brother in the pen. This idea, he's trying to I guess make sense within a worldview, find some cohesion, and be like, well, I see fossil fuels are a big thing, and this there is a opportunity for mass control. Elon Musk projects that we'll run out of fossil fuels by 2060, right? So that's something to factor into the conversation, right?
Yeah, definitely. And I think another, like you say, a grain of truth. One thing that I saw when I was looking into flat Earth theories a few years ago was flight path trajectories as a big argument that they employ. Often flights between, I think it's New Zealand and Australia and the States, how they don't take supposedly a more direct route, and apparently they take a much longer route than they could typically, and it's apparently they could just go straight to that place. I remember talking to my cousin's husband, who's a pilot, about it, because I said, "Oh yeah, I heard this theory. It's quite interesting. It's just quite funny." And he said, "Oh yeah, no, that's partially to do with stopovers of company. Different companies having different investments in airports. It's cheaper for some of them to land in an airport that actually is further away, but then also there are certain paths that they avoid based on meteorology. Based on
there'd be weather
activity.
systems. Yeah, sure.
Weather systems, and I did a quick research of that, and a lot of what he was saying turned out to be true. And I brought that to a friend of mine who was a flat earther, and he at first had some cognitive dissonance around that, but then he started looking into that, and he was like, okay, that's maybe don't go along with this one anymore. And he was still into some pretty zany conspiracy theories, but I think part of it just came from there was definitely a lot of brokenness in his life, and he was really trying to find someone to blame, and trying to prove that that person to blame controls everything and there's nothing he can do about it.
Yes.
So yeah.
Well, I mean, on the subject of planes, 9/11, you believe it was an inside job by the US government?
By someone. This is one of the conspiracy theories that I will definitely say that there are some real sketchy things going on about. and it's not just the whole jet fuel can't melt steel beams things, because there are some other things around it. The way that the towers were built to withstand things like plane crashes. Interestingly enough, have you heard of Donald Trump's comments on the day of the attacks?
What did he say?
So he was on a talk show radio, and a lot of people, Donald Trump speaks into a lot of areas that he is not the expert in. But when it comes to buildings, large buildings, especially in New York, Trump has a leg to stand on with that. And he was on this talk show on the day of the attacks, saying, "Oh, there must have been some explosives or something," because, this isn't verbatim, but he was saying that because I remember going while it was being built, going on a tour through the building and seeing all of the beams, the structural beams within the towers being quite close together, being very solid steel, and they were made to withstand a whole lot of things that could be thrown at it, even a plane. So they must have had some explosives on that plane or something. And later theories showed that maybe there were already explosives in the building. I'm not sure about that. The way that the building's kind of pancaked is quite suspect. The fact that World Trade Center 7, a building quite a few blocks away, that day also pancaked in a very similar fashion to controlled demolition pancake. And in the 9/11 report, that was put down to office furniture fire, which is office furniture fire damaging or weakening the structural support of a building that large, built in the time that it was built, seems quite unreasonable to me.
Well, worrying if you're a civil engineer, I take it. It's like you want to hope that buildings are a bit more.
So either they were built terribly and that's been swept under the rug for whatever reason, or there's something else going on.
Well, because I think this one's interesting compared to the flat Earth, right? I think this one I can at least see motive. Like I can see that, for example, if it was, say, the US that actually faked that instance, right? There's a needed justification for a war on terror. There's a desire to secure interests in the Middle East and secure military presence in the Middle East. Like, I can kind of see that and be like, yeah, I could see why they would actually say that. In no way does that make that right. It's awful. It's terrible. It's horrific. Like, what I'm saying is diplomatically, politically, I could see why that might be strategically done as a result of like a scapegoating kind of instance.
Yeah, and whether they were behind it or not, you cannot deny that Cheney, the vice president at the time, jumped on this for any
opportunistically.
Yeah, a really interesting watch is a movie called Vice. It was made, I think, in 2017 or something. I recently watched it on Netflix. It's the story of Cheney's political rise to power, and he's played by Christian Bale.
Okay.
Really good
Great
makeup.
actor.
They did it very well.
Great actor.
And it's got Steve Carell in it as well.
Wow.
Yeah, and it kind of shows that Cheney, by the looks of it, may have kind of strong-armed Bush into giving him the more important portfolios that benefited him, and he basically became the president behind the scenes, even though he was vice.
So, Bush was kind of like a figurehead, more or less.
Yeah, and because Cheney had for long wanted to be president, but every time he tried at it, he lost out for various reasons. but he jumped at the idea of this because when he became the vice, when he went to run as George Bush's running partner before that, he was CEO of, I think it was Halliburton, a large oil company. And he got a large payout when he left, but he would have still likely had some interests in Halliburton and other oil companies. And when things happened in terms of the invasion of Iraq and other Middle Eastern areas, they already had planned out zones that belonged to a lot of oil companies, planned out zones of oil fields that had been divvied up on a map. And this was pre the decision to invade, supposedly, or the decision. So that shows that there was something sketchy going on. So it's not that far a leap to believe that in the interest of gaining a bit of
the free world,
that these people would put at risk a few thousand people's lives because they killed a whole lot more Iraqi men, women, and children than the amount that died in 9/11. Now, I'm not downplaying the tragedy of 9/11. The amount of people that died is horrific.
Close to 3,000, right?
Yeah, I think above, potentially. But either way, whichever way you look at it, Cheney definitely jumped at the chance to exploit the happening of 9/11. And supposedly in the shelter that he was in, everyone was panicking, and he was just calm and decisive, and okay, we need to do this and that, and everyone was emotional. And that may have just been because he was a man with a strong constitution, but I think it's because this was what he was waiting for, if not knew was coming. So yeah,
kind of similar. What do you think about the idea of JFK being assassinated, perhaps by the CIA or the FBI? Like, I mean, have you watched any of BuzzFeed Unsolved stuff?
No, not much. I mean, I've not looked much into the JFK stuff. I know that's one of the big ones, along with the moon landing, one of the classic ones. I know that the day before he was, or maybe within a few days before the assassination, he made an address to a White House dinner and made a speech where he seems to be hinting at people within Washington, D.C. That seem to be running the show from behind the scenes. He was kind of hinting at that potentially. And a lot of conspiracy theorists put that down to Masonic bodies or other societies that have power and control. And that the assassination was a response to that, them saying, no, that's not happening. Other theories as well. I've heard of the fact that Lee Harvey Oswald was an ex-Marine, and some people have used that to say that the Marines have often used, or that the US government have often used ex-Marines as assassins who take the fall but are supposedly programmed to go wacko. And but
interesting. Because I mean, like, there's the idea that he could be a scapegoat as well. Like, he was the person they placed at the time. Or, if you watched Umbrella Academy on Netflix more recently, you reckon that it's Reginald Hargreaves, the starter of the Umbrella Academy. Have you seen that on Netflix?
No, I didn't get it. I watched the first episode or two, but no.
Yeah, like, spoiler alert for those who haven't, and like, those who've seen Umbrella Academy to the finish will know how ridiculous theory that is. But I reckon the best presentation I've seen on this, and actually they cover a couple of theories we've actually talked about, is BuzzFeed Unsolved, with Ryan Vergara and Shane Madej, or BuzzFeed Unsolved Supernatural. Like, great channel. Love their stuff. They've actually, on their popularity, they've gone off and made a YouTube channel of their own called Watcher. Love the two as characters, but BuzzFeed Unsolved was their claim to fame, and they've done some great stuff. The best presentation I've seen on the JFK assassination was their presentation on that.
I think also another interesting pop culture theory on that is the whole X-Men idea that it was Magneto was trying to stop the bullet from hitting JFK, which is how it's supposed, because supposedly the bullet went around a thing, according to the reports of where Lee Harvey Oswald was. It couldn't have had a straight trajectory, which throws a lot of concern into the mix of how could it have been Lee Harvey Oswald. And anyway, in the X-Men universe, it was that he tried to, I don't know if this is in the comics, but I know it's in the movies, that he supposedly tried to stop, and then someone stopped him because JFK was a mutant.
Right.
And Magneto was trying to stop him from being assassinated, but wasn't successful, and then was blamed for it and was imprisoned under the Pentagon. Yeah.
Well, I mean, the BuzzFeed Unsolved presentation is like the reason I find this stuff so convincing is they often they present the majority of the theories, like the most popular theories, and they do not just one, but they cover most of them in the evidence for. And I think the one that most convinced me in that presentation was the argument for a second shooter, like that there wasn't just one shooter, but that there were two shooters, and maybe it was just a case of like trying to ensure the job got done. Because that would explain that idea of like, one bullet missed, but the other bullet did the job.
Yeah.
Speaking of presidency, what do you think of the idea that the Simpson writers can predict the future?
Again, yeah, I think that one's pretty interesting. I've never been a huge fan of The Simpsons.
Maybe not.
It's not that I don't enjoy it. I just have never gotten into it in a big way. I think it might be in part due to the fact that growing up, my parents didn't really like it that much. They didn't not allow me to watch it, but they just didn't like it all that much. And at the time that it was on TV, typically they wanted to watch something else, both my mum and my dad. So there was a TV upstairs and one downstairs, and mum was watching the one downstairs, he was watching the one upstairs. So I think I just never got into it greatly. But I do know of the whole predicting the future idea.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, I had a similar thing with my family. Like, sorry to interrupt your train of thought.
No,
like, because like I had older siblings, 10 years older than me, and like so that like my parents were like, I don't want my 5, 6, 7-year-old watching The Simpsons, but like I can't necessarily have the same conversation with my 15, 16, 17-year-old, and so like when they're watching it, it's like, oh, I'll watch it with them, and that's how I ended up watching a lot of The Simpsons, so that it was kind of like one of those formative shows during my childhood. So I think I had a similar thing. Like my parents didn't really want me watching it specifically, but I had kind of a different situation. But you were going to say, sorry.
Yeah. No, so I mean, in regards to them predicting the future, I think one thing that could be said is there's an episode of South Park called Simpsons Did It. And the character Butters, he has this little alter ego when he does pretend play. He dresses up with some tinfoil and a cape and calls himself Professor Chaos. And he has this one little dorky friend who's his assistant, kind of hidden, kind of 2IC evil dude. And the whole time he's coming up with these ideas, and the kid's being like, "Oh, that's great." It's like that time in The Simpsons when they did it. He's like, "Oh, I don't want to do that now." And then the whole time he's trying to come up with ideas, and the kid's like, Simpsons did it, the Simpsons did it. And then it turns out the story going on with the main boys throughout that episode is they're creating little sea monkeys that become a bit more advanced. And then Butters is like, the Simpsons did that already. And they're like, yeah, so what? The Simpsons has been going for for so long. Of course they've come up with every freaking idea under the sun.
Yes.
And I think that could be said about their predictions of the future, is that they've been going for 30 plus years now. Maybe a little less than that, but about that kind of time. And so surely with the amount of episodes that they have and the amount of ideas that they've had to have, surely some of it would come true at some point in the future.
Well, some of them, like, I think, because I read in one article in prep for this, like, the writers, like, that have 20 writers in the room and all very funny people just vibing and just chucking ideas out. It's like, hey, what if? And the writers have actually come out and said themselves, like, it's highly likely that with that many episodes and such a continuity that there will be some ideas that just started as a joke and kind of as a social commentary, satire on something, do kind of actually happen to just coincide. And some of them they try to actively be forward thinking about what could happen. I mean, like, some of the less spooky ones are like, the smart watches, or predicting like the autocorrect thing that would happen. That was actually directly in response to a piece of technology that came out. And then the developer of the iPhone keyboard said, in response to the autocorrect episode, it's a gag in one of the episodes. Okay. Yeah. And like they said, actually, we need to get this right. It actually inspired them, seeing how badly this was done. It's like basically one of the bullies is actually saying, he gives memo, it says, beat up Martin. And then it translates to eat up Martha. And it's just like, yeah. Like, there were the faulty voting machines. Sometimes there were instances of it actually something happened actually directly inspired something else that happened. Like, the tobacco plant was actually developed. I don't know if you heard about that. Like,
really?
Tomato tobacco. Someone actually got that idea and said, I'm going to go and develop it. And they brought it to the writers of The Simpsons to actually try, which I think is kind of cool.
Wow.
They had the faulty voting machines, which were like, Obama's trying to vote, Homer is trying to vote Obama and it keeps on going to Romney. Like, that actually happened with the machine. Yeah. But then there's some like spooky ones. Like, do you know about the Ebola outbreak that was kind of predicted, more or less? Like, Bart's sick at home and Marge gives like, here, read this book and it's Curious George in the case of the Ebola virus.
Really?
And it's like about like 5 years before there's a huge massive outbreak in Africa. Or, the Shard, like, which is in a famous building in London in the UK. It's there's a future episode where like it shows Lisa's wedding, I think it is, and it shows like a picture that looks eerily similar, like it's to the Shard, and even the position that it would actually be in London at the time. Like,
wow.
Obviously, there's the Donald Trump presidency that was actually predicted. I don't know if you heard about the horse meat scandal.
Was that Burger King?
Apparently, it was Ireland. Like,
Irish Burger King.
Yeah. Like, basically, these school lunches were saying like, assorted horse parts to make lunches for students, and it was like a joke. And then 9 years later, they found horse DNA and over, as you said, over 1/3 of beef burger samples from supermarkets, and pig in 85% of them.
They also found them in I think Burger King patties in
the
UK and Ireland at some point. Yeah. Although I think that in the Burger King it was a small amount. I can't remember. I'll have to look that up. But yeah.
Yes. Did you know they predicted the Siegfried and Roy tiger attack?
No.
Yeah. Like, so obviously, like, they have this joke where, they take a tiger out of its territory and they shoot it with a dart, and then like the tiger has a flashback and like attacks Siegfried and Roy. But like, in 2003, they were attacked during a live performance by one of their tigers.
Yeah.
And the episode happened in 1993, so 10 years previously.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow, that's hectic. Hectic.
Yeah. There's some weird stuff, eh? Oh, what was another one? Forgive me. They had a formula where Homer did the mathematical working out for finding out the mass of the Higgs boson particle.
Okay.
There was an episode where, like, Fat Tony, he was taking ferrets and actually he was trying to pass them off as toy poodles by gluing cotton balls to their heads. And so there was an Argentinian man, he received a shock, like when he thought he was buying a toy poodle and found out it was actually a groomed ferret. Yeah, just weird stuff, eh? Like the fact that it happened. I loved how Homer talked to Stephen Hawking about a donut-shaped universe, and now that's actually a presented theory in cosmology. Like Stephen Hawking jokes with Homer in the episodes, like, I really like your theory of a donut-shaped universe. Like, I think I'm going to steal it. And like that's actually now the cosmological idea that the universe is shaped like a torus or like a donut.
Yeah.
Yeah. So proven, basically. They predict the future.
Yeah, definitely. Epistemologically. So, yeah. What do you have any other main theories or
main theories?
Just other theories to run past?
What's your take on Epstein?
So the Epstein one is an interesting one.
As a former corrections officer, I imagine that would be interesting.
Yeah, although I don't put much into that. What I would say is typically in Western prisons, although New Zealand prisons are far, far ahead of US prisons in policy procedure, but they do have similar ideas that they do borrow tactical and procedural ideas from, but so I wouldn't put my previous experience into this theory, but what I would say is there was a post on the popular forum board, on the popular forum website, 4chan, couple hours or an hour or so, I believe, well before any media outlet or government organization or prison system had said that he was dead. They had said Epstein dead, will be said to be ruled like suicide or something along the lines. Then in the same thread, they were talking about how there was a military-esque vehicle that came in through their vehicle bay. They were told about an hour or so beforehand that there will be this vehicle arriving. Don't follow procedure. Don't note down their number plates. Don't search the vehicle. Don't try your best to just let them through. They'll tell you something and you will let them through to the certain area. And then after that vehicle had come and gone, Epstein was supposedly dead. So then that lends itself to the theory that, hey, it may not even be Epstein. Some people have theorized that that vehicle that went in and out maybe did a body swap.
And that wasn't actually Epstein. Epstein's actually still alive. That's
a theory. And
like a body double,
yeah. Either way, I don't think it was suicide. Based on looking at their own protocols of prisoners on observations for suicidal reasons, you'd think something would have come out about people losing their job about that.
Yes, you would.
Although they would obviously have to sign very rigorous non-disclosure agreements, but they could also counter-sue potentially. But I think it's a real tricky situation because there's a lot of money involved. Being a billionaire, and a lot of people will be able to buy certain information to be put out and to be withheld. But I am of the opinion that it wasn't suicide.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm inclined to think that way as well. Like there's a fact that like the guards that were actually stationed apparently hadn't been working at the prison very long. You know, this is a maximum security prison that is supposed to follow certain protocols. He was in an unusual cell that wasn't as advanced as some of the other cells apparently. Like the autopsy didn't necessarily match like some of the things the body was supposedly, some of the like claims about how he would have died could not have actually matched. Like how he could have supposedly hung himself in this particular cell doesn't match up. The guards changed shift on the night. The cameras were off actually in the cell where he actually, when it happened, like all these things which are seemingly breaking protocol. Yeah. And like another, like, so I saw Filthy Rich on Netflix, which covers this quite in depth, and they give quite a balanced perspective on this particular part of it because it's right at the end, like the last episode of a 5-episode season. But I remember something interesting they thought that was mentioned was the fact that Epstein actually in his house, in his townhouse in New York, they examined it and they found like a whole other room behind, like a hidden room within the actual complex, which had just like a massive TV screens and just basically footage of seemingly powerful people, supposedly, where they could be viewed and kind of, screened basically. And you can kind of think like that's an amazing, there's amazing potential for kind of blackmail and for kind of corruption where like you've got a powerful person, kind of like the Bohemian Grove stuff we were talking a little bit about, right? Like once people have kind of like entered into that situation, which, Epstein has perhaps provided for them, you're kind of like in this either humiliating situation or this kind of like by blackmail situation. Well, we're in this together now. You've actually kind of put yourself in this position of vulnerability. We're both in this position of vulnerability. Therefore, we can trust each other with that. Like it's a weird kind of twist on like, loyalty, I guess. Yeah. But it's understandable that like a person in that situation then kind of brought to justice, a lot of people would potentially want him out of the picture if he can use that situation to be like, well, I'll give you these people if you get me out of this, That's supposedly how he overturned his initial conviction when it looks like it was all going to go to trial, because it wasn't the first time that he'd actually been brought up on similar charges, and it looked like he was going to go away for a long time. Yeah. So.
Yeah. I think that leads into like a lot of really interesting conspiracy theories around child abuse, and
yes,
that can go a various amount of ways. You can look into the theories about I think it's Bryan Singer. The have you heard of his things?
No, who was he?
So he, and I may be getting the name wrong slightly, but I'm pretty sure it's Bryan Singer. He was the director and I think producer of a lot of the earlier X-Men movies, and maybe some of the more modern ones. Supposedly, according to the conspiracy theories, he has an inkling for young boys. A lot of people who supposedly come out and talk about it in a public realm get shut down quite quickly.
Yes.
Another thing about child abuse within conspiracy theories is one that was very popular in the 80s and 90s is satanic ritual abuse theories that came amidst the satanic panic. And there were a lot of theories, a lot of stories coming out of children or adults who in their childhood had been abused in what appears to be a ritualistic manner. And in a lot of their therapy sessions, things were coming up where they would remember, be it regression therapy or otherwise, where they would remember certain things present in the time of their abuse, such as pentagrams, goats' heads, other symbols, very often associated with satanic rituals.
Well, I heard, was that on the back of like Aleister Crowley kind of like popularizing Luciferianism, like as far back as the 1950s, or?
Well, Aleister Crowley, he was actually early 1900s, late 1800s.
Oh, really? So
Yeah.
as far back as then, yeah.
Yeah, so he wasn't a Satanist as such. Some people would label him that, but he was an occultist who he can actually be thanked for a lot of modern occult and other movements. He supposedly had a huge impact on, I think it's Alex Gardner, I think that's the name. Forgive me if I get the name wrong, who wrote the Book of Shadows, which is one of the primary texts for the religion or movement of Wicca. He was supposedly one of Crowley's disciples, and supposedly Crowley had a lot of input into the Book of Shadows. He also discipled L. Ron Hubbard.
Oh, really?
Who is the founder of the Scientology movement. Anton LaVey, who around, I think, the 1950s, maybe the 1960s, I think 50s, wrote the Satanic Bible.
I think that's what I was thinking of. Is there a connection to LaVey and Crowley?
So LaVey's claimed to take a lot of inspiration. Well, he definitely did. He took a lot of inspiration from Crowley's teachings. As is with a lot of occult systems, Crowley did definitely have a lot of teachings that you can see definitely influenced Anton LaVey's philosophies and ideas within his occult systems. But I think so that there was with the satanic panic that happened in the 80s and the 90s, a lot of Christians or people who were not pro satanic ideas were becoming more and more aware of the spread of satanic ideas with artists like Marilyn Manson and Rob Zombie. These artists who are out there very dark and gloomy and teaching teenagers to do drugs and have sex and all these things that traditional American conservatives did not want their kids being near at all.
Yes.
So out of this came a lot of what was called SRA, or Satanic Ritual Abuse. And the claims of satanic ritual abuse have been widely criticized and questioned by a lot of professionals in psychiatry and in the counseling field. They seem to be quite cautious of believing any of it because a lot of the counseling that led to these revelations of satanic ritual abuse, either the methodology within the counseling is something that can be called into question, or there was potentially influence from parents or other parties that were kind of pushing them to say this. And I'm not saying that there wasn't ritualistic abuse on or satanic ritualistic abuse. What I will say is people like Anton LaVey cannot be blamed for that, or nor could the Church of Satan, because the Church of Satan, as much as I have problems with their ideas around God, Satan, and or in their view, the lack thereof, as much as I have problems with their I would not say that they are to blame, because they often condemned not only ritualistic abuse, but they condemned sacrifice of even small animals, which is interesting because some of them may have been practicing it anyway. There seems to be some evidence that shows that, but and I mean some of them in the higher up leadership levels of the Church of Satan, but that's another story. But either way, I don't think they can be blamed for any of that ritualistic abuse. If so, there's no proof for it. But yeah, it's an interesting thing to look into it, because again, one of the most horrible things a person can do is harm a child.
Yes.
Especially sexually. So again, if you want to vilify a person or a group, why not accuse them of sorcery involving the ritualistic abuse of children?
It's true. I think because there's two things that come to consequence that are of consequence in my mind when it comes to this, right? One is the fact that sex trafficking is kind of like the taboo issue of our time, which is happening on a absolutely gross, horrific scale, and it isn't talked about, and it is a global problem. Like, it's one of the reasons that they say that, you know, modern day slavery is worse in scale than it ever has been, you know, via the comparative, you know, 19 centuries, 20 centuries that have led up to this point, you know, because sex trafficking features in that. It's a form of human slavery, right? And so some people make those connections to stuff like Epstein. Some people make these connections to the stuff like secret societies. But I think that then leads me to my second point, is that I think there does seem to be this common theme of, say, secret societies running the world, and that's a kind of like a conspiracy theory that's quite popularized, right? And I think my stance on that is that it's not unlike when I was mentioning reading Totaliaria by Ian Wishart, right? And so, like, I'm agreeing with a lot of what's being said at the start of the book, but towards the end, it's like, okay, and this all proves, you know, Luciferianism is, you know, the affront for basically the New World Order, and the UN is an end to that object. And it's like, okay, I don't doubt that there are people who hold these opinions with some unanimity, and that they actually do hold these beliefs in real strength of conviction. But to then say that their reach is as far-reaching as people might say, that's where you lose me. Like, I'm thinking, yeah, I believe that there probably are people that hold such views, but it's like their influence isn't nearly as far-reaching as they would hope it would be, right? Yeah. I see kind of like a lot of vying groups for kind of like, we want control and we want power and we want influence in the back of our belief. It's like, you know, the sheer fact that I can say, you know, Luciferianism, New World Order, Freemasonry, Scientology, all these examples of different groups is kind of giving you the impression that, like, not all of these groups see eye to eye. All of them are kind of wanting that kind of mass control to kind of actually, if everyone could just see the same way we do, you know, even I think people in Christianity are now kind of like our more, I don't know, primal moments. We would like to think that way. It's like everyone just needs to see the world as we do, right? But my point being is, I think there's this presence in, say, US culture in particular, where let's enculturate, let's kind of like get people used to the idea of, you know, buying in and kind of being kind of humiliated so that we have something on you, so you're actually in this community. And like, some of these people who go out of these fraternities go on to be like high-ranking officials in certain, you know, businesses, or like, you know, politics, or different spheres of society.
Like the Skull and Bones fraternity. Have you heard of that one?
No, but
Okay.
I'm imagining more fraternities. Go on, sorry.
So, for those who are unaware, Skull and Bones was a fraternal society based out of Yale University in the States. And George Bush, when he went to Yale, he was in the Skull and Bones. I believe his George W. Bush, that is, and I believe his father, George Bush Sr., may have also been a Skull and Bones member. When questioned about it by the press, he just often says, "Oh, I can't talk about that. Can't talk about that." And there are different theories as to what the initiation rites are, which it seems that the initiation is quite disturbing. Supposedly you lie in a coffin with a string tied around your member whilst you recount all of your sexual experiences to a room full of men, and it goes on record, and it's quite humiliating and quite just derogatory in a lot of senses. But yeah, that's what George Bush was a part of, and the Democrat who he was running against, John Kerry, was also a part of the Skull and Bones Society. So, sorry, go on. You're talking about the US culture of fraternity, sorority hazing.
Yeah, well, I wonder if that's like, I mean, secret societies aren't a new thing, but I mean, like, you know, Scientology, like in likes of Going Clear, or, you know, Leah Remini, for example, coming out of the Church of Scientology, like, when there seems to be this trend in, like, you know, human history, when people kind of go via blackmail, via corruption, via, you know, secrecy, you know, weird stuff happens, you know, like, you know, arguably, you know, or outrightly dangerous stuff, or like, you know, sus kind of stuff happens when, like, you know, people are kind of sworn into secrecy. And I just think it's a very icky kind of environment to kind of obviously create conspiracy and create, well, we're all in this together, so therefore, you know, you're sworn to actually not reveal anything or not tell anything. So yeah, I do wonder, like, you know, if there is, again, the grain of truth to some of these stuff that happens in America, because you've already got that culture of, like, you know, well, if you're not one of us, then of course you're not privy to the stuff we know, because everyone's kind of in on it together. Like the Bohemian Grove stuff just, like, made me think, like, this is another instance of exactly what we're talking about. You know, Alex Jones years ago was coming out with that stuff, and about, like, you know, why are these, you know, US statesmen, you know, worshipping in front of an owl statue? You know?
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, it's definitely, it's a big thing to look into, and I think at times, because they're labeled with the term conspiracy theory, they're often thrown out and disregarded as valid.
Yes.
When some of these are potentially, or are definitely, very valid concerns that one should have for their nation, or for the state of the world, you know. And I think some of them are just fun. Not everyone finds it fun to look into, but I think a lot of people do find it quite interesting. And yeah, I think I would encourage anyone who's been interested by this to reach out and talk to us about what you think. And before we end up wrapping up, at some point I'll list a few different conspiracy theories that I reckon are some fun ones for people to look up, be they ones that I believe or not. That's not they're just really interesting ones that I find you can go down a few rabbit holes with.
Yeah, like, I think, because I'd love to know your thoughts on this, man, and our wrap up, like, I think there's a propensity towards Christians to believe some of the stuff for a couple of reasons, right? It's the fact that with a lot of these, there is some grain of truth where, people are trying to actually, within their worldview, make sense of something that doesn't seem to make sense. They're trying to find unity. They're trying to find cohesion of the one and the many, like their own individual perspective and how it bridges with, the communal, the, connection, the cause and effect, actually, relationships between all of the ideas, right? I think, like, on the back of, say, Descartes' work, talking about, like, I believe, therefore I am, and Immanuel Kant's work, in the 16th century and 18th century, respectively, and on the product of actually other Enlightenment thinkers, epistemologically, and by epistemologically, I mean theory of knowing, epistemologically, you found progressively that faith became not the superseding lens through which to view all things. It became just another body of knowledge and just another way of knowing. And as a result of that, you actually find, well, science actually takes the place of faith as being kind of the supreme lens through which we should actually determine all other types of knowledge, right? Faith, or theology specifically, known as the queen of sciences back in the day, it then has taken the place of that. And then actually we find, I think, as, we're products of our culture, we're products of streams of thought that define culture over generations, right? We find, I think, Christians are already predisposed toward believing despite rational proofs, because faith is a body of knowledge which is not considered to supersede all forms of knowledge. But faith is kind of that knowledge. It's like, oh, I don't have all the proof, but I just trust, I just believe. And it's not credited as actually, no, but it's just as legitimate as any of those other forms of knowledge.
Yeah.
Arguably more, you could say, if you take a kind of presuppositionalist apologetic or rhetoric. But I also think there's an attractiveness in these beliefs, right? It's like mysticism has continued throughout the ages. You mentioned Wicca before, and different religions have had their own forms of or mystic trends or mystic variations, branches off from the actual mainline religion. In the first century, the church was dealing with Gnosticism, right? It's this idea of we have the secret knowledge and those people don't.
Yeah.
We have an access to something that gives us the true understanding of how things are, but people don't. And there's a pridefulness, there's an attractiveness to that. There's a, I think,
that's been repeated in more modern schools of thought, like
Yes.
Mormonism or Freemasonry.
Yes.
And I think one thing that could quickly be said about that is the source of lies is often Satan himself. And Satan, while he may be creative, he's not a creator. So often one of the things I've heard said about these kind of things is he recycles his ideas here and there. But then also, I guess the same could be said about just fallen man, recycle the ideas of fallen man.
Well, doesn't C.S. Lewis references that idea in Screwtape Letters, doesn't he?
Yeah, I think so, yeah. That
Yeah.
might be
Did you, sorry, you were going to say something?
Yeah, so I'll just get to, I'll give you all five, I guess, five interesting conspiracy theories in no particular order.
Yes.
We've got the Shakespearean Francis Bacon conspiracy theory that William Shakespeare did not write his things, but Francis Bacon, the Rosicrucian, who was part of the secret society Rosicrucians, wrote it, which plays into those conspiracy theories. We've got Hitler living in Argentina post-World War II as a fun conspiracy theory.
Died in the 1970s or something, didn't he?
Yep.
Yep.
Two theories that are covered by Alex Jones, but also other people. We've got the Bilderberg Group, and as has been mentioned earlier in this podcast, we have the Bohemian Grove group. Then another very interesting conspiracy theory I find, it depends on who you look up, but the theory that the American and French revolutions were used as a test pilot for the Illuminati to establish world dominance through revolution. So yeah, those are 5 conspiracy theories I would recommend the viewers look up, be it for serious research or just for fun. If you're so inclined, you'll probably have a good time if you haven't looked up any or some of those before.
Heck, I know I will.
Yeah.
I love that. Yeah, I think like shit, to sum up on my end, I think as well, like I want to give some advice to just kind of Christians generally around actually how to navigate some of this, right? Because in a post-truth era, we're trying to actually navigate, so what is true? In journalism, you know, when society is post-modern at its core, that affects its institutions, like journalism, for example. I remember, I've mentioned this to Caleb before, but I had a friend who was studying journalism a couple of years ago, more of an acquaintance, but she was saying how she was being trained in journalism about how to write from a perspective. And I said, I was of the understanding standards of journalism meant that you had to present the facts and let people make their own opinion. She's like, no, that's not what we're being trained to do anymore. We're actually expected to write from an opinion and try to convince someone of your point of view. And it's like, if that's happening at the tertiary level, at the education level, of course it's going to affect actually how journalism comes across. Because in the presentation of actually what is media and what is factual and what is not, and what we typically trust in trust journalism, in the era of fake news and the era of actually, you know, trusting our media outlets and social media to determine truth and share truth, it can be hard to discern. I would say there is this principle within scripture of actually discernment and wisdom. My old teacher used to say, the person who inspired me to become a teacher, that wisdom is knowledge used righteously. I love that because I actually hearken to that often. It's like, you know, well, if you use knowledge, what does righteous mean? How can I use this with justice, with fairness, with kindness, with nobility, seeking truth wherever it can be found? A couple of verses come to mind. Like, I think of, for example, Matthew 10, verse 16, Jesus actually recommends to the disciples, behold, I am sending you out as sheep among wolves. Therefore, be as shrewd as snakes and innocent as doves. I love that verse because it's so pictorial. You know, you actually think about the state of the church today, and it's very hard to discern what actually is genuine and what is not. Churches have had schisms over church history trying to work out that very question.
Yeah.
But I think that's quite a pictorial image because you think about the snake in the garden, that's a reference to Genesis, and actually we're supposed to be as harmless as doves, you know, the symbol of the Holy Spirit, you know, like how can we be shrewd, how can we be discerning, but also not harm anyone with that ability to foresee and see through. I think of actually the principles for the Corinthian church who were very gifted spiritually, by, if church history is anything to go by in the actual Corinthian account itself. You've got that principle in 14 verse 29 where Paul's laying out how to actually do, you know, essentially workspace, gift-based ministry. He's saying in 14:29, 2 or 3 prophets should speak and the others should weigh carefully what is said. So it's like that idea of like a prophet is actually someone hearing from God. But I think there's a principle there that actually we should actually weigh each other up. We should be accountable. In a church, I think, you know, that maybe looks like the eldership testing what the pastor says. In a group of friends, you know, if I say something stupid, I hope Caleb's going to be like, you know, hey man, you know, we're on a podcast and we're in a teaching capacity. Hopefully you're not actually affirming that, you know, like, and, you know, hopefully if I say something wrong, I would actually come back to actually apologize for that. 1 John 4 verse 1 tells us to actually test the spirits, that famous passage, because many false prophets have gone out into the world. And so it's this idea that actually false prophets, you're actually someone who is claiming to speak with the authority of God, someone claiming to speak for God. I think if anyone is actually posturing, putting themselves up in a position to say, I am giving the gospel truth, I'm giving the truth of the world, of reality, of humanity, and you need to listen to this over others. And we're getting into that culture.
Brian's
Interesting. Exactly. Well, I even think about like in an age like, with the states being so as polarized as they are, or conversations around BLM, which are worthy conversations and necessary conversations.
Yeah.
But we're getting so polarized, and actually, ironically, in a post-truth era where people are saying this is the only one way to view things, and if you don't hold this particular set of views, then you're a Nazi or you're a bigot or you're, what's wrong with the world.
Yeah.
Like, we actually have to realize that actually we need to test every spirit. I think we need to have a worldview that actually acknowledges that we have the people in front of us who we need to love as Imago Dei, but also acknowledge there's a spiritual warfare in the background of everything that we do. Michael Heiser does a lot of work on this, and I think we'll explore some of his work in following podcasts, because he's a really worthwhile reference and really worthwhile, a unique voice and a necessary voice in this day and age. But I also would appeal to you in your own spiritual walks, with the examples of people like, you've got Joseph in his time and age. He came before Pharaoh because of his ability to hear from God and that relationship he had with God. Or Daniel, who was, prioritized in the Babylonian court, the superpower of its day, because of his ability to actually seek to know what actually God's will and word was in different situations.
Yeah.
You have the likes of Solomon, who, when given basically a wish for whatever he wanted situation from God, didn't say, can I have 3 million more wishes?
Yeah.
Essentially said, God, I don't want fame, I don't want fortune, I want wisdom to govern your people. I want the ability to tell what is knowledge used righteously. Like, I want that above all things. I want to know what is right and what is wrong, and how to use my knowledge in situations to weigh into that. So I'm really kind of advocating in these situations we don't know and we can't work it out. There is a need to appeal to the relationship we have with God and the safeguards he's put within his body, like fellowship, like good study and knowledge of the word, like prayer, like actually, yes, experience, but not in isolation of those other three mentioned, like church tradition and actually what's been held, and actually understanding that God hasn't put these safeguards in place by accident. The church is supposed to be a light in the world, and I think actually affirming the church tradition and the way things have been done throughout generations, and that there has been persistence. And even though there has been shift and drift, I think we've also seen that God's word has continued, his ways have prospered and persevered. And I think actually there's a call to something higher, an affirmation of God being present in even those circumstances to each of us. I encourage you, seek accountability, test the spirits, talk to people about those ideas. Don't take your ideas as the gospel truth. Have humility about any ideas that we hold, and hold them loosely, until you can actually come to a place where humbly you can say, I think I have wisdom in this area to actually say, I think I can judge rightly on this matter. That would be some of my advice. Would you speak to any of that, Caleb?
Cool. No, I think you've covered it all. Yeah.
Cool.
So,
Amen.
Yeah, I just wanted to say to all viewers, thanks for listening. Definitely take Jared's advice here. I would echo that.
With a grain of salt.
Everything with a grain of salt. Do your own research.
Amen.
Be discerning. Test the spirits. And submit to the scripture. And if you have problems with that, research the scripture. Even if you don't have problems with that. But, cool. So, thanks for joining us again. Or if it's your first time here, thank you for joining us, and welcome. You're welcome to come on back and watch some of our older, or listen to some of our older podcasts and what's coming in future. So, from the both of us at 2 or 3 gathered. To all you 2s or 3s. I regret saying that instantaneously.
And wherever you gather.
Wherever you gather. Have a good one, and God bless you.
Know that he's in your midst.
Amen.
Bless you guys. Have a good one.
See ya.